Well, welcome to everyone here. I hope that you availed yourself of the cookies, and if you didn't, they will. If Brian stays away from them, they'll all still be there when it's over. Although I see my staff leaning toward the cookie table, so I'm glad you're here. I'm Steve Joyner. I'm the Dean of the College of Leadership and Public Service, and we're the college sponsoring collaborative conversations this year. We're very excited about that. I want to just issue a really warm welcome to all of you. It's our first event of our annual Collaborative Conversation series. And I'm also excited because it's the same time that we're also launching a new college this fall. The College of Leadership and Public Service is a new college at the university, but it's geared for exactly this kind of conversation. We wanted to do something completely different, so what we did is we pulled together some of the most practically engaged groups on campus. It includes 4 graduate programs, 2 undergraduate programs with 150 students, and all of these programs are geared toward engaging people in the community around them. And we want to use that opportunity to kind of grab onto that power and launch into the next chapter of programming on this campus. And we're going to be doing some outstanding programming, some incredible research, and invite the community in to have some of the toughest conversations around and to talk about the complex issues that we're now facing in our society. And so we're really excited about that. Last fall we did the subject around water, and from the highest levels of state government to the local streams, we created a space to discuss that topic, and it was well received. One of our professors took on the challenge of completely restoring a dead stream here with a group of students as a kind of a launch out of that discussion last year. So this year we thought we would crank it up a little bit and talk about something that's right in the middle of the political conversation right now, and that's immigration. And we want to take 4 months to have this discussion, each from different vantage points. So each of the programs, Law, Justice, and Society, Sustainable Practice, Civic Leadership, and Conflict Management will all talk about immigration from a different perspective. And I think to get the fullest impact, I would hope you would come to all 4, because I believe then you'll get kind of a broad understanding of what's going on. More information and dates will be available to you online, I think in your seats also, so that'd be great. I want to thank our panelists, who Randy's going to introduce here in a minute, and to our own Law, Justice, and Society for hosting the event. That's Professor Spivey back there. But I also want a special thank you to our co-sponsors. The Nashville Public Library, Andrea and her staff are here, right? Would you guys stand up? I just want to introduce you guys. I know you just really wanted to do this. They are sponsoring with us, and right now I believe you're the sole recipient of a grant that's studying Latino Americans' 500 years of history in connection with PBS, right? And that's part of this connection also. And so we hope to use these conversations to connect in the larger community, along with our own Beeman Library. Elizabeth, is she in here right now? Elizabeth Heffington, she may be still downstairs. From the Beeman Library is connected with us, the Human Docs, Lipscomb's Intercultural Development Office, the Legal Aid Society, all partnered together to help us have this conversation, and we're very, very excited about that. The Beeman Library has put together this incredible public online resource area on this subject matter, and is there a way, Phyllis, or is there a way is that up on the board there?
Yes.
It's right behind. I'm a very aware speaker. Apparently, it's right behind me. And it is one of the most useful and engaging kind of websites on the material. So leaving here tonight, if you want to go to that website, you'll see even more, and we're excited about that. And finally, let's do something. I'm really proud of our students, and I know none of you came under duress from your professor. Would our students at Lipscomb please stand up? I'd just like to see who all here are students. So that's great. Thank you for coming out. So welcome once again. Excited about the series that's about to start. And I'm going to turn it over to Professor Spivey.
Good evening. I'm Randy Spivey, and I am the Academic Director for the Institute for Law, Justice, and Society.
I want to kind of give you a roadmap of how this is going to go tonight, because I know people generally don't like surprises and you like to be able to feel when all of this will end. And so we want to kind of get a sense of that. We will start with some questions that I've prepared for this panel that I'll introduce to you shortly. And then several of you should have in your hand note cards and pens. As you go through the evening, if you have questions that you would like to hear the panel address, please write those down. We'll take them up at the end and kind of go through them. We are not trying to suppress your speech so much as make sure every question that gets asked is on the video that we are filming tonight. So if you have questions, write down the card. If you have a question and you don't have a card, raise your hand very discreetly throughout the evening, and Danielle and Brian will kind of be watching the group and will bring you a card as we go. We'll probably have, we're scheduled for 90 minutes, but we're going to have a good and full conversation as we go. The Institute for Law, Justice, and Society serves two primary purposes. The first is an undergraduate degree that trains students interested in social justice, public policy, and socio-legal issues. And the second purpose is to serve the community, and we do that through legal clinics that we host each month, but also by convening conversations like the one tonight. At the heart of both of those purposes is the guiding question of our institute. And that question is, how might we work together to form a more just world? Over the past few months, a presidential hopeful and a refugee crisis in Europe has amplified an already vibrant conversation around immigration laws and policies. But too often what is left out of these policy discussions are facts and people. Laws and policies do not exist in a vacuum. And like Steve said a minute ago, this is not going to be a complete conversation. We are not going to be able to have a complete conversation about immigration law and policies over the next 90 minutes. If you were hoping for us to put federal regulations up on the board and parse through them, I'm not going to suggest you leave now because we'd want you to stay, but that's not what we're going to do tonight. Some of you are very relieved at that. Laws and policies don't exist in a vacuum, and wrestling with the topic must begin with an understanding, not in the abstract, but an understanding of how policies affect people and how they affect immigrant families. If we begin with talk of quotas and walls, we will inevitably miss the people. And so that's what we're here to talk about tonight, how the laws and policies that we put into place affect families on the ground in person. Tonight we have with us Bob Lenard. Bob is an immigration attorney in Clarksville. He is a current member of the American Immigration Lawyers Association and has been listed on the U.S. Department of Justice Executive Office of Immigration Review website as an attorney since 1999. Please welcome Bob. We also have Stephanie Teatro. I was so close. Stephanie Teatro, she is the Director of Advocacy and she is a former Director of Advocacy and current co-executive director of the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition. She is also on the steering committee for Nashville for All of Us, a member of Mayor Carl Dean's New Americans Advisory Council, and an executive committee member of the National Fair Immigration Reform Movement, and a board member of the National Partnership for New Americans. Please welcome Stephanie. And finally, we have Douglas Ribeiro. Douglas is an assistant professor here at Lipscomb in the Department of Psychology. His research interests include culturally responsive counseling interventions and resilience among immigrant groups. Please welcome Douglas. So let's get started. Bob, I'm going to start with you.
Yes, sir.
Give us a sense, as you practice immigration law on a day-to-day basis, give us a sense of the common problems that immigrant families walk into your office with.
Well, first of all, I wanted to say that I'm very happy to be here, and also I'm very grateful to Randy for inviting me. In my office, we don't distinguish between citizens and non-citizens because everyone who comes into our office is entitled to legal assistance, no matter where they're from. That being said, it's very important for an attorney to determine whether or not the person is a citizen or not, because different factors come into play when we're dealing with non-citizens. And we'll talk about those in a few minutes. And while I'm on the topic, I wanted to say if anybody has a question, just let me know. I'll be happy to answer it for you. But the standard things that most lawyers are concerned about affect immigrant families as well. For example, adoption issues, juvenile issues, family law issues, divorce, injury cases, criminal law issues. But they seem to have a lot of other problems with regard to the things that we take for granted, those of us who are citizens, namely in the area of housing. It's commonly known that in order to get a good place to live, you have to have to be deemed creditworthy. In order to have good credit, you have to have a Social Security card. A lot of these folks don't have Social Security cards. I mean, they can't get one. So they have a lot of issues with regard to housing, in particular substandard housing. And the sort of people that will rent to them aren't necessarily interested at all times in fixing them. In the wintertime, there's problems with heat. And when we have small children involved, that's a serious issue. Those are the sort of things that we see a lot of in my office. The second thing is issues having to do with your car. You know, you have to have a driver's license. In order to get a driver's license, you have to have, a Social Security card, proof of birth in the United States. If you've recently had a renewal for a Tennessee driver's license come to your home or at your office, if you get your mail at your office, you might have seen that it came from the Department of Homeland Security and the state of Tennessee. Well, the Department of Homeland Security is the federal entity that works with the state of Tennessee to make sure that all of us who get Tennessee driver's licenses have proof of citizenship or lawful status. So if you're in a rural area and there's no bus and you have to get your children to school or you have to get to work and the weather's bad and you don't have a driver's license, the issue is, what are you going to do if you can't drive your car? So we have a lot of those issues. Believe it or not, a lot of times folks can't even buy car insurance, which is mandatory in Tennessee if they don't have proper documentation. We have lots of issues with insurance agents making sure that people are properly insured. Getting tags for your car. The car tag's expired and you want to get new tags. Those are the sort of issues that commonly come to our office, the sort of everyday issues that people take for granted. School issues, not so much, because ever since 1982 in the United States, all non-citizen children, undocumented or otherwise, have been guaranteed by the Supreme Court the right to K through 12 education. A lot of people aren't necessarily aware of that, but being entitled to education means you still have to get to school. You have to have appropriate clothing. You have to have been able to spend a night in a house that has utilities, heat in the wintertime, cool air in the summertime, so the child's not stressed and parents aren't stressed either. So those are the sort of issues that I deal with on a daily basis. A lot of times people say to me, well, Bob, you spend all your time in immigration court, don't you? And I say, no, I don't. I don't really spend a lot of my time in immigration court. Immigration court, the immigration court in our state is located in Memphis, and it chiefly deals with removal, formerly known as deportation. We now, and have for several years, called it removal. And that's viewed as a very strict sanction. And those of us who practice in this area would like to think of it as banishment. Someone who's removed from this country is ultimately banished. So I do a lot of removal proceedings, but not as much as one would think, because everyone understands that it's difficult to banish a parent who has children in the United States that were either born here or minors. But those are the sort of things I deal with.
Let me stop you. Let me stop you right there, because you talked for a long time before you ever got to an issue of immigration law, as we would think of it. You talked for a good while about issues with cars, issues with housing, and very common type issues, which I think is a different perspective on a conversation on law and policy, that it's not just the immigration laws, the immigration code that we think of, but the everyday stuff that really affects this. You talk to a lot of attorneys about how to properly represent immigrants in this country. Talk to me a little about what those attorneys often do not understand when they are representing an undocumented person or an undocumented family.
Gee, I was hoping you wouldn't put me on the spot.
Not too
I mean,
late.
that's
You're
sort of.
sitting in the chair.
I don't want to be presumptuous, but I think that it's important for people to understand. I think a lot of times we understand clearly that we attorneys are licensed by the state. So, for example, I'm licensed in the state of Tennessee, and I am taught and I apply state laws, whatever those laws are. But I don't practice federal law in the state of Tennessee. I don't practice immigration law in the state of Tennessee. So unless you stumble upon someone who does immigration law, chances are that person won't know anything about another layer of rules, namely federal law. Because in day-to-day practice, when you're dealing with the things I spoke about earlier, adoption, family, divorce, injury cases, criminal law, one doesn't deal with federal law unless one is in the federal system, for example, like in federal court. But so a lot of state practitioners haven't put that second hat on, haven't considered that second layer of, if you will, federal law that impacts a lot of people. And I'm speaking about the 11 million plus people in this country that are undocumented.
So if I'm hearing you right, a holistic representation would take into account the immigration law as well as the stated issue that a client comes to you with, be it divorce or something like that. But there are ripple effects from that initial state proceeding that also affects immigration status. And that's difficult for lawyers to see both of those things.
Well, I don't think it's difficult. I think it's just, something we're not taught in our law schools. The state bar examination, for example, doesn't ask any questions about federal law or federal immigration law. So practitioners aren't, unless they're interested in that area of law, they're not aware of it, I guess would be more accurate to say. But the second part of the issue is, a lot of times I'll have cases referred to me, standard state law issues like divorce, for example, and a practitioner will say, "Hey Bob, I know you practice immigration law. I referred this lady to you. She needs a divorce." And I'm like, you don't need to hire me. You can represent her yourself. And what I hear is, how is that? And I'm like, well, we're going to be preparing before our county judge, our state judge. He's not applying federal law. He's applying state divorce law. So, they're often, and most always, I guess, grateful to hear that, gee, they don't have to refer folks to me. The same, let's take a personal injury case. Recently, a woman came to see me who said that her attorney, had told her case was valued, kind of high up there, whatever, in excess of $1 million. But when he found out that she wasn't documented, he downgraded her case like 90%. He said, "Oh, it's only going to be worth now, 10 cents on a dollar, and we'll be lucky if we can get that." Well, I told her I would call him up and find out what was going on, and I called him up, and he said, "Well, I just assumed, that there was going to be issues there." And I'm like,
Such a great lawyer voice, by the way.
I was like, dude, there's no issues here. I mean, there's no discrimination against folks who are handicapped or who have, what are you relying on? What state law are you? I said, pull out the state law that you're relying on. And I mean, he was a little embarrassed. I was a little embarrassed. I don't like to be put in those sort of situations, namely reminding attorneys that it doesn't matter who comes to see you. You have to treat everyone the same. I mean, we're not permitted to say, well, we can't sue you, because you're not a citizen. But I want to close by, Brandy, I don't want to interrupt you, but I want to close this one little section by helping everyone out understand something that's extraordinarily important. When I talk to lawyers, when I brief lawyers, whether it's all the immigration lawyers in the United States, the 14,000 immigration lawyers, or just the lawyers in my community, or just the lawyers in Nashville, or just the lawyers in Tennessee, there seems to be a pervasive misunderstanding about what are we talking about when we're talking about people who are undocumented? You know, what I mean when I'm talking about people who are undocumented is people who don't have the documents that are necessary, to example, to show up at the DMV in Nashville to prove that they're lawfully present in the United States. That doesn't mean that they don't have credit cards. That doesn't mean that they don't have a bank account. That doesn't mean that they don't have a professional degree, a law license, an MD degree, an architectural degree, a real estate license, real estate titles and deeds, birth certificates from their home country, even state adoption certificates. When I'm talking about someone who's undocumented, I'm talking about someone who doesn't have the requisite federal permission to be in the United States. And that's all I mean. Sometimes we hear this pejorative term illegal, or illegals apply to folks who are undocumented, and I candidly don't understand that. And I find that a lot of lawyers, particularly the ones who feel they have to downgrade or treat people differently if they're undocumented, they run into this, they have this problem because they think that if one is undocumented, one is illegal in some way. One is, you know, perhaps a miscreant who hasn't been arrested yet, who's kept in the shadows and was lucky or fortunate enough not to be picked up by state or federal authorities. So I wanted to talk about briefly, so that everyone in the room knows how that works, because even one of our presidential candidates recently got it wrong. Improper entry in the United States is a crime if you're caught crossing the border by a border agent and you give him false documents, or you lie to him, or you resist arrest. That's a crime. But that would be true of anyone in this room who lied to a police officer and resisted arrest and gave him false documents. So that is a misdemeanor, by the way, $50 fine. But even in those sort of cases, when we're talking about foreign nationals, they're entitled to a trial, and the government has to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. So what happens is, in the majority of cases, they just turn those people around and send them home. Of course, that doesn't stop them from coming back the following day. But I don't think the Border Patrol necessarily takes those folks to court, because the cost would be prohibitive. The folks who reside in this country, on the other hand, the worst that they can be accused of is being having unlawful presence, and there's no criminal thing out there that would allow a policeman to enter my home to arrest my friends who are undocumented. I mean, I could tell him, gee, these guys are undocumented. What's the problem? I mean, is there a statute that you're fixing to arrest these people for? If it is, let me know, because I'm not aware of any on a state level or on a federal level either. So that's important, because a lot of times I get this impression that people feel that it's okay to treat others as second-class citizens, or we don't have to do our very best for a second-class person because he or she might be undocumented. And that's the biggest problem I have in my practice of the law with respect to encouraging people to learn about these sort of issues, whether I'm talking about lawyers or whether I'm talking about civilians. So, and I apologize, Randy, for cutting in, but I just wanted to make sure that everybody clearly understood about the improper entry, crossing the border, caught lie, false documents, and being here.
I think that's so helpful, especially from an attorney's perspective, to go back to the original call of being an attorney and what that means and what the obligations, first and foremost, to your client, to think about that. Stephanie, you have a little different perspective. Shed some light for us on the common laws and policies that you run into as an advocate for immigrants and refugees, and those laws and policies that seem to land most harshly on them.
Sure. And just want to start by saying thank you to Lipscomb for hosting these conversations and for choosing immigration as the conversation, not only because of the sort of news and presidential candidates making it a hot button issue again, but also because Tennessee and Nashville actually have the fastest growing immigrant population of anywhere in the country. So really the future of our city and our state is really dependent on having a better and deeper understanding of these issues. And so I guess what I would say, to speak to the most fundamental, our actual federal immigration law, is that it was designed for families, but the way that it's currently implemented is actually really failing families and undermining family values. So there are generally 3 ways that people can come to this country: sort of humanitarian reasons, as a refugee or an asylum seeker, for employment reasons, or through family. And family-based immigration has always been the largest and most robust way that people come to this country. But the fact is that our immigration laws have not been updated since before I was born. Our worlds have changed, the ways that families move, the way that money moves has changed, but our immigration laws have not. And so there's a couple ways that that impacts families, right? The first and foremost is that the number of visas that are available, the number of opportunities for people to come to this country hasn't been increased in decades. So for example, if I was a US citizen and my brother lives in the Philippines, how long do you think it would take for them to be able to migrate legally to this country? Just throw out a guess. 10 years? Higher. 22 years, right? 22 years, when for families and people who migrate because of their families, maybe because of a situation of their loved one in the US, that is an unworkable time frame. And we haven't really increased the opportunities for people to be able to come to this country legally at all. And so what we're left with after decades of not reforming our immigration law is, as Bob said, 11 million people who are without a lawful immigration status. And I appreciate sort of the overview of all the different ways that that can affect people. But it's also true that it doesn't just affect those 11 million people. There's actually 16 million additional people in this country who have at least one undocumented family member. So the question of undocumented families is much bigger. And at the same time that we have failed to update our immigration laws, we've actually really ramped up the enforcement of really broken and outdated immigration laws. So I think from our perspective, one of the largest impacts on a lot of immigrant, especially undocumented immigrant families, is the threat or the real experience of having a loved one deported. And so I think at the high point in 2013, there were more than 1,000 people every single day who were being deported. In President Obama's tenure alone, it's been over 2 million people. So you can imagine 2 million families just in the last presidential administration whose lives have been fundamentally altered. And that sort of scale up, right, the way that our country's been deporting so many people has really depended on local institutions, largely local law enforcement, to help facilitate these deportations. And so not only in terms of the perceived threat from federal immigration, but also from local government officials. So I would say, hands down, the biggest impact on families is not being sure or certain, sort of not having that security of family unity.
But talk to me a little bit more about the enforcement provisions that seem to affect families harshest. You talked about the 16 million people who have at least one undocumented person in their family. Just on a step-by-step practical basis, what does that look like for a family that lives without that security?
Sure. And so, I mean, I think Bob could tell millions of stories about how complicated it is and how different it looks. I know one Lipscomb student, actually, who she is undocumented. Her 2 sisters are citizens, and her mom has a green card. And they all came together, right? But somehow she remains the only undocumented person. And I think there's also sort of a myth that if I were to marry an undocumented person, that they would be able to become a citizen. So either through marriage or through children is generally how people sponsor their family members. But if you're in the United States and you're undocumented for any longer than 6 months, you would have to leave the country. For me to sponsor my husband, he would have to leave the country for a decade. And so there actually is no way for people to regularize their status and until there is an act from Congress. But again, in the meantime, it's not just these laws are bad, let's wait till they get better. In the very meantime, every one of our members who is undocumented knows somebody who has been deported and knows somebody who has been deported because they got pulled over for having a taillight out, right? And so you can't overstate how your sense of security, your family planning, your general well-being would be affected by having that threat of deportation hang over you every single day.
Working as an advocate, you mentioned myths a few minutes ago. What are the common difficulties you have in talking about this very complex issue with folks that are just now trying to get their minds around it?
There are many. I guess to put it broadly, I think one of the issues is sort of a fundamental misunderstanding of the system. And as Bob said, and as you alluded to in your introduction, immigration law is incredibly complicated. It's more complicated than the tax code. And but I think people generally believe that we have a set of immigration laws and that good laws are being broken by bad people. And the way to solve, our immigration crisis, or the way to solve questions around undocumented immigration, is through a sort of criminal justice model, when really it is an issue of updating our civil immigration laws. And also I think that people really believe that there is a path to get into, that being undocumented is a choice, and that you could have come in lawfully if you had wanted to, that you chose to go sort of the other way. And I think that is fundamentally false.
Let me set you up with probably, as an advocate, the easiest question I'll give you all night. Two-part question.
Okay.
One, why do people immigrate to the United States? And two, what are the benefits of having a thriving immigrant community in the United States?
Sure. So how many people in the room are native Nashvillians? Very small percent. And why do people move to Nashville? Shout it out. Work. Good, really good food. Yeah. So people immigrate for all sorts of reasons, right? Generally for economic opportunity, to be with their family. My family immigrated from Canada, and it's because my dad got a job in the United States, and we all came together, and even through the best of circumstances, it still took me 14 years to become a citizen. But people move. People have always moved, and people will always continue to move. And it's our job as a nation of opportunity, and a nation that was really built by immigration, to make sure that our immigration laws reflect our current global reality, but also really uphold our American values and our family values. So it's not a question of whether people are going to stop migrating or whether they're going to stop migrating here. It's just a matter of how we set up systems to make it happen well. And I forgot your second question.
Second question was, what was my second question?
Oh, what are the benefits?
Yes, what are the benefits of having a thriving immigrant community in the United States, or more specifically, Nashville?
Absolutely. Well, so Martin's Barbecue was thrown out, but also, have you driven down Nolensville Pike? I mean, immigrants definitely enrich our cultural fabric, but it's also undeniable that immigrants are absolutely an economic engine. Immigrants start businesses at a rate of 2 to 1 compared to US-born folks. And if you think about it, if you think about an immigrant, no matter what their legal status is or how they came here, it's a very self-selecting bunch, the kind of person that would pack up everything and go to a place where they knew nobody, where they had no roots. That is entrepreneurial by nature. And so it's true across, I'm sorry I keep speaking in so closely, that across the country where there are immigrants, there is economic growth. And so while here in Nashville, where we've had sort of the fastest growing immigrant population and people didn't see it coming, and a lot of people were sort of caught off guard are sort of sister cities in the Rust Belt where they've had population decline in Dayton, Ohio, and Pittsburgh and Detroit. They are literally competing for immigrants and refugees to move there because they know that it will revitalize the economy and it will make such a much more rich community. And so I think we've definitely seen that in Nashville, and we're seeing that across Tennessee. And I think that for the native Nashvillians that raise their hand and all of us who call Nashville home, it's our jobs to help our neighbors and our communities understand that, because I think that there's too often a temptation, whether it's from local government or schools or otherwise, to look at immigration as sort of a set of challenges that now we have to figure out how to manage, when really it's a matter of assets and opportunities and how do we really harness the potential of an increasingly diverse community. We talk about MNPS a lot and English language learners and how are we going to solve this problem. And while that's true, there are a certain set of challenges when your infrastructure wasn't built for 140 languages. What does it mean for Nashville that we are graduating students that can speak 3, 4, 5 languages, and how do we celebrate that instead of seeing it as a threat?
Douglas, let me shift to you now. You're my lone academic up here, so I'm immediately uncomfortable with you. But you've done a lot of research into kind of this, we've talked causation and have started leaning into effect that our immigration laws and policies have. Walk us a little bit through your research and what you've seen from immigrant communities and the effects that some of these policies have.
Thank you. And, it's really a privilege for me to be here tonight, especially because I did get a parking spot for all day today, which was like, really special for me on campus to just drive in, have a nice place waiting for me. It's like huge privilege. It's just amazing. So thank you for this opportunity. Yes, I am, one of the professors here, and I kind of came in, into this research in an interesting way. I'm originally from Brazil, so I came in as an international student, and I did something that was probably much harder than my dissertation, and that was actually completing all the paperwork for my residency first, and then for my naturalization or citizenship. At the end of that, I thought that I could apply for the bar, but I don't know if I have enough encouragement from that to just go into how complex, that whole system is. So as a clinician, I work a lot with immigrants. And I did that for several years. And when I started my PhD program, I was really interested in kind of recognizing that, okay, I've seen some things in the room. I wonder if these things are generalizable, meaning that do they apply to more than the handful of people that I see? So one of the questions that I had was actually thinking of stress. Now, all of us experience stress in unique ways. Now, immigrants have to do something that is unique, and that is a type of stress that is adapting to a new culture. Now, that is determined by the individual person as well as the environment in which they are trying to adjust to. So it was very interesting for me to understand how does it play, or what is the role in which society makes it harder or easier for immigrants to adjust. And what we found was fascinating. So I looked at couples and families primarily. And one of the conversations that I had, and I was sitting in this dining room kitchen in a small apartment complex in Atlanta, Georgia. And this couple was basically telling me their story, and I was asking them about their day. Now, kids are running around, so it's kind of, complex, but there was a time in which I could see that things slowed down. And this family told me something that it really stayed with me. And this lady said, one of the hardest things for us is when we leave the house in the morning. Because we really don't know who is going to be able to get back home at night. Now, that's very complex. And I thought, this might be an isolated situation, right? It might be just the fact that, this is how they see themselves. Now, it wasn't. To my own realization, the fact was that that was pretty much a consistent story in which families actually, in their attempt to adapting, does that make sense? Coping with the stressors that they saw, they had to create strategies in which they would have to make the hard calls of thinking, who is going to take care of the kids if we do not return? We actually lived in an apartment complex that was raided by immigration officers one time, and a family, probably the next couple of days, came to us, since we were one of the few ones that lived in that complex that were documented, and they asked us if we could take care of their children. Now, my wife and I were recently married, and that was, not exactly what we were thinking, having elementary school kids. But it was a sobering question. So I think I'm trying to minimize the stereotype of being an academician and not talk about my research methodology, but I'm really trying to kind of convey this idea of the stressors that are placed by policy or by, just the reality of, society adjusting to a new group is a very complex one. And that's what we've attempted to explore through research, try to find numbers to see if this is something that is present throughout many communities.
Yeah, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you not talking about numbers and methodology. As a lawyer, we don't do that very much. But I do want you to talk a little bit about what you found the tensions that are placed on families to do to family dynamics. And I know we've talked a little bit about common diagnosis and things that you've seen in immigrant families. Talk a little bit about the practical personal effects that you see coming out of that policy.
Yeah, one of the things that while I was in Atlanta, that was very interesting was the shift in immigration policy that were happening, not at the federal level, but at the state level. So if you could remember, maybe a few years ago, you had a movement in which started in Arizona, then Alabama and Georgia, in which local law enforcement would enforce or be encouraged to enforce federal law. So as part of that movement, one of the things that we started to realize was, okay, so this is occurring at the societal level. Did that impact people's stress levels? Which was true. They started coming at a higher rate, in which we would see folks, because of their inability to cope with stress. Now, all of us have a threshold of stress in which we have coping skills that allow us to manage our daily lives. And like for many of you, so many of my students, they're starting graduate school and they're trying to figure out, what is my threshold now? So for many of these immigrants, they achieved that threshold and they started coming for counseling or for services. And one of the things that we realized was that not only the stressors that were occurring at that time were taxing to their ability to function, but also it was reinforcing or connecting to previous stressors. So the reality was that we would see several immigrants coming in and discussing the traumas that they experienced at home or their home country, the traumas that they experienced in the crossing of the border, and then the traumas that they have experienced through employment and other situations. So one of the things that I became very much at the time overwhelmed by was just the sheer amount of trauma, and then finding ways of treating that was very significant. So within the psychological diagnostic models, you have stress, you increase that to trauma or traumatic experience, and then what you usually see in veterans or groups that have been exposed to a natural disaster would be post-traumatic stress disorder. Different levels of severity, and the most severe being post-traumatic stress disorder was what we were observing in many of those immigrants.
So I'm going to ask all of you this question. Recently, one of the presidential candidates has released a comprehensive immigration plan, which was the subject of an article on the website 538, Nate Silver's website that's very statistics and methodology heavy, which I only understand part of that, but still, they looked at it and found that right now the most popular immigration policy that has been released by a presidential candidate is the one that is least grounded in fact. That's a little frightening to me. So how do you begin to square the fear, it seems, that's commonly out there with notions of another very popular subject in our country, which is family values? How do we begin to square what seems to be a tension out there based on what we've heard tonight?
I think I can try, and I'll just attempt to analyze presidential candidate based on their. No. But I think what I will say, as part of, I think, my human experience, fact is overrated, or even truth is overrated in the face of fear. So every time that I experience fear, there is a level in which I distort whatever reality I perceived to soothe that fear. Now that's a very common and understandable reaction, and what I've seen so far has been that conflict in which we value families, we value families staying together. We even have grants which encourage local agencies to help families stay together. But in fear, we counter our most noble values in order to feel safe. And those are very powerful things.
The other portions of that article suggest that an undocumented immigrant is more likely to be the victim of a crime than they are to commit a crime, which seems initially to be a little counterintuitive. Talk to me a little, Bob first, and then we'll go down the road from there, about there's got to be fear involved in any dealing with law enforcement for an undocumented citizen, even when they are the victim of the crime. How do you advise clients or people seeking your advice that come to you with concern about interacting with law enforcement, even when they have not done anything wrong?
Well, that's a great question, Randy.
Thank you.
I remember the kids were small. My son was 8, my daughter was 4. We were pulling out of a Dairy Queen on Riverside Drive in Clarksville several years ago, and I pulled out too fast. I had a cone in my hand. The police officer that was behind me wasn't happy that he had to hit his brakes. I was on the city council in Clarksville at the time. I remember I was wearing a suit, and I just picked up my kids at the Clarksville Academy. When he pulled me over and put his hand on his weapon, I got to say that I was really pretty freaked out. I had my little girl in the car, my son in the car. She was 4, he was 8. I said, "Well, I got to stay cool here. I got to, the kids never see me freak out." But I got to tell you, I was, I was pretty stressed out. I'm a ex-Green Beret, Airborne Ranger, competent attorney, a member of the city council, and I was frightened. I mean, I don't know if anybody's had any run-ins with the law, but I mean, perhaps it would be different if I was with myself. But, I think that's the most, really put your finger on it, Randy, that's the most pervasive problem that we have, is that people are so fearful of the authorities. We in this country have, I would say a majority would agree with me, not a corrupt police force. A lot of these folks that we have contact with, the undocumented folks, come from countries where, the authorities are corrupt, and there's a graft, and there's blackmail, and there's all kinds of bad issues, and so they're extraordinarily extraordinarily frightened of having to deal with the authorities. And the avoidance is the chief way of dealing with the problem, meaning, just stay away from it. And avoidance is such an extreme that one will not even report a crime when one is a victim. So those are, fairly serious issues, and along with those come trust, because as an American attorney who deals with law enforcement, I think people have this notion that, well, gee, he's probably just the same as they are. They're probably all corrupt. So it's kind of hard to get folks to tell you, what happened in a lot of cases, because there's trust issues. It's like, well, why should I trust you? Why should I trust you? Why should I tell you? So those are the sort of things that I run into quite commonly, Randy, on that particular issue. And I hope I answered that question.
Yeah. Stephanie, talk to us a little in the same vein of what does it do to an immigrant community that is fearful even when victimized because of the policies and laws that are in place?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, this is something that we do see all of the time. And one moment that really just stands out for me, and it was just last year, and it was one of the hardest moments I've had working for Turk, was it was a family with a devastating story of abuse of a child. And the mother obviously loved her child so much and would do anything for her. And they had been keeping this secret for months. And the neighbor, luckily, had known about Turk. She had worked with us at some different point, and she finally convinces them, fine, if you're not going to call the police, go to Turk. So they come to our office, and it took us 3 hours to convince her that it was going to be okay to call the police. And you think about all of the women and families and people who don't have that neighbor, or that neighbor hadn't heard of this organization before. And I think, to be honest, it puts us in a hard position to advise people when in reality there is real and growing collaboration between immigration enforcement, the people who deport families, and our local law enforcement. So it is true that not the police have no formal affiliation, but as soon as someone goes to jail, as soon as someone who's pulled over for not having a driver's license because they're ineligible to have one, or for any minor encounter with law enforcement, even if they're not convicted, they're all of a sudden sort of in that pipeline. And a lot of people who've lived in Nashville for a while will remember that we were part of a very controversial program called 287G for 5 years.
Secure communities.
That deported 10,000 people from Nashville. But there's been 2 iterations of successor programs, and that continues. So our jails, there's a direct pipeline to immigration enforcement, but in fact, immigration enforcement is showing up in courts. So if somebody did take the step to call the police, but then they show up to be a witness, immigration is in the court system. And in fact, they're even in our probation offices. And so how, as sort of an advocate and somebody who wants to make the community safer, how do we advise people? And so I think that is why we believe wholeheartedly that as a matter of public safety, there should not be a formal relationship between our local law enforcement and federal immigration enforcement, because not only does it harm those families who may be impacted by a deportation, but it makes our whole community less safe when people are unwilling to call the police even when they're victims of crime.
Douglas, let me ask you this, and I don't think you're ready for this question, but I'm going to ask it to you anyway, because it strikes me that it's important in this conversation. We've talked about the challenges that Metro Nashville Public Schools have. In those schools are hundreds and hundreds of teachers. There are people like Stephanie around. Talk to us a little about the inevitability of having to have students that have these stressors in your classroom, or have clients or folks that come to you for help, and the effect that has on both the classroom and the workplace, but also on the individual that is faced unexpectedly with this person that is dealing with all these different stressors that were not part of the job description when they signed up.
Is that a softball? Is that the I think, I've had the privilege of working with schools, children at the schools, as well as teachers. And one of the things that I think it really resonates with me was what Bob was mentioning early, and that is just kind of information, just the reality of the fact that, and I tell my teacher friends a lot of this, it's, being a teacher is really hard, especially, K through 12, because our society expects teachers to solve all social problems, and to get a child and transform them out of poverty, or to provide, children with more than they could ever be able to do. And what I've realized has been, many teachers contacting us, mental health professionals, saying, hey, I don't really know what to do, right? Because like was mentioning before by Stephanie, I don't know who to trust. And I think many of the students and teachers, they want to do the right thing, they just don't know all that is out there in terms of protection for those that may report a crime or not. And we've had many cases in which people would contact us saying, we have a suspicion of abuse, but we really don't know what that will do. So that is always, a very complex process. I think, as a psychologist and a counselor, one of the things that have been helpful is that idea of confidentiality, and having a space in which confidentiality, although limited, allows for us to have some of these conversations. And Stephanie and I were talking. I've participated in several times developing counseling centers for immigrants. And the truth is, building that trust is difficult, primarily because there's so much misinformation, but also so much fear. And I don't know if I'm answering exactly what you're asking me, but the complexity of it is that teachers who are hearing messages and themselves have concerns about, okay, are these immigrant children taking advantage of this system? And how do I educate them, and how do I connect with parents? It is, without a doubt, where I see the most complexity. And I'll add to the idea of law enforcement and the sheer difficulties that come with language barrier. And in a short interaction with an officer, being able to rely on a language in which, for most immigrants, is a language in which is very limited and power-laden, in which they only speak with using that language to individuals that have power over them. So if I'm talking to my employer, that language is different than the language that I use with my friends. So there is an extra level of intimidation that may even be introduced to that dynamic outside of the just sheer fact of breaking the law.
I think that the point of complexity is just the general theme throughout this is, I told you we're not going to be done in 90 minutes, and we'll be done in 90 minutes, but we're not going to be finished with this conversation in 90 minutes. I want to ask you guys one more question, but I want you, Danielle and Brian, I want you, if you have written down questions that you would like to ask, to go ahead and hold them up, and Danielle and Brian will go around and pick those up as a panel asks this last question. Anybody can start, anybody can finish, but talk to me about the most common misconceptions that you see, either about immigrants or about the effects of our current law and policies regarding immigration.
Biggest misconception?
Yes.
I think I can start with one that, it's a conundrum that we have in research, and that is that in policy we hear so much about immigration or immigrants overutilizing the health system. And I'm sure many people have heard this, but what the the research and the literature shows us is that immigrants, especially first-generation immigrants, they tend to be healthier and live longer than U.S.-born citizens. So you can look at the literature and see that, in fact, immigrants are healthier. They actually, as a group, tend to use less of these resources. Now, their children, on the other hand, use or have the same health outcomes as U.S.-born natives or people that were born in the U.S. So those are one of the things that in the literature we always trying to figure it out is I think there is a discrepancy between the data and what is actually being said or the actual fear.
So, I mean, I think that there's countless misconceptions that have come up, right? Whether it's sort of, as you mentioned, the rates of committing crimes, immigrants commit crimes at lower rates, immigrants pay taxes, all of these things. But I will say that I think one thing would be that the belief that immigration is a federal issue and that it's only the federal government's responsibility. And I think that while immigration reform and fundamentally changing our immigration laws are definitely a matter for Congress to take up and will continue to pressure them to do so, I do think that immigrant integration is a local issue and that we are making choices as a community and we will continue to have choices to make about how we want to welcome new immigrants, how we want to facilitate their integration, how we want to ensure their success, and how we want to really make sure that immigrants are part of the fabric of our communities. And so I think that sometimes the bigger questions of immigration or the bigger questions of migration and policy can seem far away, but there are decisions that this institution can make, that the next mayor who's elected this week can make. And so some of you who are businesses have decisions to make. And so it is a local issue as much as it is a federal issue.
Al Capone was caught because he wasn't paying his taxes. And, from my perspective, and this is extraordinarily important for me as an immigration attorney, when I go to immigration court, the chief problem is, how can you prove, Mr. Leonard, that your client has been in this country for the requisite number of years? Your Honor, I have the gold standard. I have a U.S. income tax return. The gold standard. Many people don't realize that the Internal Revenue Service captures income from everyone, regardless of the source, whether it's lottery winnings, whether you work under the table, whether you're undocumented or not. And traditionally, the Internal Revenue Service issued tax identification numbers that looked like really super cool little Social Security cards with eagles on them, and they were, I don't know, they had some sort of 3D embossing. And this was used as a primary form of identification. From my perspective as an immigration attorney, the most common misconception is that non-immigrants don't work. They work and they file taxes, because remember what I just said, that's the number one way of being able to get status in the United States, showing that you've been here for the requisite number of years, lawfully paying your taxes. And I wish more people knew that, and that would counter, I guess, perhaps this counterintuitive notion that we have this large pool of, good-for-nothing folks that are taking advantage of the rest of us.
Okay, first question is I think, very straightforward, and we probably should address this up front, but here we are. Remind us of what it takes for an undocumented person to become a U.S. citizen and the cost. We pride ourselves on practical questions, and yet that is the most practical question asked tonight.
If you're born in this country, take for example the birthright conversation we're having. If a woman crosses the border, let's say she came from Cambodia and she landed in Montreal and she crossed the border where the Frenchies are and the French Canadians are, and her child was born in the United States, the question that's not understood is, when could that mother obtain status by virtue of the fact that her child was born in the United States? And I'll answer the question because I hate being put on the spot, and I hate to put people on the spot. You have to be 21. So mom is never going to gain status until that child turns 21. So this is, again, this pervasive notion out there that, gee, these children are brought into the United States, and a pregnant woman comes to the United States, give birth, and then boom, the child is a U.S. citizen, but then the mom is too, or whoever came with mom. of a family member. That's not true. You have to be 21. So that's the first thing people need to know.
I think I would just add that it really definitely depends on the individual circumstances. There are some people who will have a path to citizenship maybe when their son or daughter turns 21, but then again, like I mentioned, they might be subject to a 10-year bar, so essentially never, because who's going to want to leave their kid or their home of 21 years? Some undocumented people are eligible, for younger folks who came when they were younger through the President Obama's executive order from 2012. It's $500. If you're not going to pay for an attorney, it's $500. But immigration is expensive, but it's not just a matter of time or cost, because for a vast number of undocumented people, there is no option. It's not a matter of saving enough money or being patient enough. There's literally nothing they can do.
How does,
Sure, I'd be happy to explain that. So, like I said, there's sort of the three ways people come: by employment, by family, or by humanitarian. And if somebody is here without status, they're without leave. If they don't have a U.S. citizen parent or child, and if they're eligible to they would be able to be sponsored by their child when they turn 21, or by their spouse. There is potentially a way for them to overcome the barrier of having to leave the country for 10 years. But if you don't have that, there's no one to sponsor you. And as far as employment visas go, I mean, it's hard when you're here and you're undocumented, but really we don't make enough opportunity our economy really depends on an immigrant workforce. Some economists say that we need 400,000 sort of lower skilled workers to make our economy, immigrant workers, to make our economy run. But we only have 5,000 visas available every year. There's only 5,000. If you're not a millionaire, high skilled, advanced degrees, you've got 1 in 5,000 chance of getting a path in.
let's talk about that, because that's where the next question comes in. How does the U.S. government determine how many of these visas to offer from various countries, and why are some countries allowed more visas than other countries?
That is a complicated question, and it changes, and Bob might be able to shed more light, but it's partly based on the number of immigrants that come from that country. And so countries that have more immigrants coming, they'll have longer waits. Mexico, India, China, there's a long wait. The Philippines, like I said, there's a long wait to come. And so there's sort of an algorithm or formula for how many are available at any given time, but Congress sets the sort of ceiling. The how it's given out, that sort of changes often, but Congress since 1996, we've had the same overall cap on where people can come, and it is sort of a problematic formula in terms of what countries, looking back from the earliest quotas, there's been a lot of sort of structural racism in terms of what countries are allowed to send people here. But I guess the answer is Congress decides.
Let me ask this question, because it reminds me that for so many, this conversation is tied to issues of homeland security, and tied to issues of, to some degree, of terrorism and border control and things like that. And I think those are very, very difficult things to, in most people's minds, separate. So this person asked, what are the biggest threats to easing up on the immigration enforcement that we are doing right now? What are the dangers that we face nationally if that were the path we decided to take?
Yeah, so one thing that President Obama has talked about when he's been changing the enforcement laws is the need to sort of prioritize enforcement resources. And so I would say that if 1,000 people were getting deported every single day, we're probably not focusing our enforcement resources in ways that really fundamentally keep people safe. By setting up systems that just kind of create this dragnet for moms and dads, people who have roots here, who have never been convicted of any crime, if that's where our dollars are going, then yeah, there might be a chance that we're sort of missing out on sort of larger threat. So I think the danger is when those are conflated, right? People have always moved to this country, people are coming for jobs and all the things that we talked about. But what is that analogy where you use the same hammer to hit sort of two different nails, right? I mean, when we're approaching family migration or when we're approaching questions of how people can petition for their undocumented spouse, when we're just using that one sort of mallet of punishment, right? So if somebody who's been a contributing member of the Nashville community for 20 years and I know a woman she's been in the U.S. for 25 years. She's a volunteer at a church. She teaches GED classes. She's a model mother, and her daughter just turned 21. And the only way that she has is if she goes back to Mexico for 10 years. She has to leave because we just are saying, well, you broke the law. This is the sort of mallet that we're using. So I think it's ineffective policing, it's ineffective enforcement to just have this sort of one-size-fits-all for a country of millions of immigrants.
Douglas, I want to go back to the health insurance question briefly that you've already talked about a little bit. So if a parent of an undocumented child, if a parent is undocumented but the child was born in the U.S., can that child receive Medicaid? If so, how do we at least approach discussions of cost in that context?
Yeah, and I think the first question, yes, the child that is born in the U.S. would have access to state-granted resources, like I believe Tennessee has 10 Care or things of that nature in which would provide support for that child based on the income of the family and so forth. Now, there's a philosophical approach to how we approach society, and that is remedial or preventive. And the reality is that our system, primarily because I understand our tax resources tend to be utilized in a more of a reparative or punishment. It feels much more likely for folks to be okay with their taxes being used if that means some benefit to them, like safety. So our tax dollars tend not to go into preventing issues like, difficulties with poverty or health. It tends to be kind of remedial. So then that's where the cost comes in, is our attitude is one in which as a society we would prefer to have remedial solutions than preventing health problems or even tackling difficulties with poverty, which you think about the amount of money that we spend on incarcerating individuals versus the amount of money that we spend on education. Then you have a philosophical approach to society in which I think dictates a lot of how these problems develop.
Can I add to that?
Yes, you can.
Okay.
But before you do that, because
Yes.
I want Bob to start thinking here, I'm going to give each of you just a short, brief moment to kind of sum up where you are as we close. And I'll start with Bob and work down. Go ahead.
So I just around the question of cost too. I mean, I think for one, Tennessee is a sales tax state, right? I mean, everybody who moves here, all of our services are funded by people buying things, and the last time I checked, people aren't asked for their immigration status when they're deciding whether or not to pay taxes on a purchase, right? Same with property tax. 25% of undocumented people in Tennessee own a home. So people are contributing at the same rate. When a family moves here from Arkansas, we don't look around and say, well, we shouldn't educate that kid from Arkansas because the family just got here, right? What we believe is that hopefully we'll do a good job educating this kid, and if we're lucky, they'll stick around and continue to be part of Tennessee and continue to contribute. And so I think it's kind of a flawed question because people are paying into the system from day one, but also it's about investing in our community.
Bob, let's start closing out.
I think that from my perspective, things are getting better. And what I mean is that, as an analogy, if we're talking about domestic abuse, and I have a young woman that comes to see me and she says their fiance is beating her, she's got her arm in a sling, but she doesn't want to report them. And I recall last year when she came in, she had 3 of her teeth knocked out, but she doesn't want to report them because he's going to lose his job. I've always had issues with people who are afraid to, report things. I think we need to shine a light on these sort of things. It's very difficult to tell a victim of abuse, you need to report this. You need to shine a light on this behavior. This isn't right. This needs to be fixed. More people need to know about this. So when I say things are getting better, the analogy is I'm grateful that we're having a national conversation on this issue. The story that I have is when I was a small boy growing up in Chicago, we had a lot of camp survivors in our neighborhood. I grew up in a Polish-Jewish neighborhood in Chicago. What was Catholic? We were Catholic. There was a Catholic school there, but there was a Polish-Jewish neighborhood. And I remember we would see all these movies in grade school. We had mass every day. We had to wear uniforms, not like you kids today. But I recall we saw these movies about these concentration camps when we were in 5th grade, and they were just, if you've seen one, you know what I'm talking about. But I remember I was very nosy when I was a small boy, and I would go up to these folks and I would say, "How could you not fight back? Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you guys do something about what was going on?" And I think that the most common answer I got was, "Well, nobody really had a spotlight on what was going on. Nobody had a national conversation on what was going on. Nobody really seemed to care about what was going on." So from my perspective, things are getting better because we're engaging in this conversation. Whether there'll be a remedy or not remains to be seen. I don't think there's anything for anyone to worry about. I think that there's lots of good people out there like Douglas and Stephanie that are invested in these people, and they're major parts of our community. There's instructors like Randy, and there's people like all of you. And from my perspective, from a legal perspective, things are going well. I don't have any big anxiety, and I'm hoping the rest of the panel shares my point of view.
Steph?
I guess I'll close. I feel like I brought a little bit of the doom and the gloom of how challenging some of our systems are. I think that immigration to Nashville is a wonderful thing, and I think that I've only been here for about 4 years, and I am so excited to be here. And I feel like often when I talk to family in other places or colleagues in other states, they're like, "Wait, immigrants live in Nashville or immigrants live in Tennessee?" But we have such a tremendous opportunity, and our city is getting so much better and stronger, and we can make a decision, and a lot of our city has made that decision already to do this the right way, and to build systems and build a culture and build a community that really is proud of that diversity and really leverages all of the assets, and I think that there's a role for all of us to play in that. And so, for those of you, many of you who said you were new here, I think, welcome to the sort of the new South. The new gateway city is right here, and that's a really exciting thing, and I think we're making history in Nashville with how we choose to do that. And that said, we have a lot of work to do, and so you should all get involved with us and work to make our policies better.
I think the last, what I'll highlight is throughout a lot of the work that I've done, one of the things that have risen to the top in terms of protective factors, and meaning things that help immigrants cope with stress, that we found has been social support or access to social support. We actually found that about 20% of marital problems between couples could be explained by lack of social support, which was fascinating. Kind of getting myself out of a job thinking that, you just need to find a good community network and you guys will be doing good. But the reality, I think Stephanie said something that I wrote down and I think is very, very important. Immigrant integration is a local issue, and the power of being neighbors. And I think, I've, been in the South the 15 years that I've been in the U.S. and partially because I cannot do cold weather. And I do not complain about warm and, humid summers, I'm fine. But the reality is, I think this idea that we've been losing, this idea of being neighbors, or kind of taking that step into entering an immigrant's world or universe, is something that I think as a society we can do, and we do really well. We just need to take, that fear hat a little bit and put it on the side and put that welcoming hat and say, we can have fun tonight by saying hi. I think that's one of the things that I've seen in many communities, that with a hopeful tone that Bob has kind of put us in, I see a lot of hope in that. And I see a lot of hope in that in Nashville and throughout a lot of the things that have been done.
One of the things we hope to do with these conversations, both tonight and in the 3 that follow, on what dates? Can somebody give me the dates? October 20th is the next one. One of the things we hope to do is to leave you with the one thing I am sure of, which is this is not an easy conversation. This is a complex conversation. This is not just a conversation about immigration. This is not just a conversation about family. This is a much bigger conversation. To kind of prove that, I'll say I grew up in Gadsden, Alabama. And my dad was the preacher of Central Church of Christ, which was right across the street from the county jail. One of the things that I believe Bob sent me this week was an NPR article about Etowah County, Alabama, which is the county where Gadsden sits. And the county jail that was right across the street from my church is now being used mainly to hold people who are waiting on deportation. And what I remember as a kid is walking out of that church and seeing an African-American family yelling up to the top of the jail to have a conversation with the family member that was incarcerated at that particular time. I have that vivid memory as if it happened all the time. And I can now imagine that same thing happening with a Latino family. And I bring that up because this is one of the questions that we got tonight. Do you think that immigrants can be totally welcomed if Black Americans do not feel welcome in America? This is a complicated conversation. You're going to take different things from these conversations. You're going to be thinking in all kinds of different directions as you leave. This is what I'll be thinking about, at least in part tonight, is beginning to tie these things together, because it is less a conversation about law and policy, it is less a conversation about family than it is about who we are and who we want to be. Let's thank our panel for being with us tonight. Thank you, and we will see you in October.
You guys did really good.